right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch program. We're delighted that y'all could join us today. A few quick announcements before we get started. If y'all are here in the auditorium, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. And those of y'all on Zoom, please mute your microphones and use the chat for your questions. We'll have a Q&A session for everyone at the end of the lecture. And I want to thank the Friends of the Museum of the Albemarle for their continued support of our educational programming. Although we are a state-run museum, it's actually the nonprofit Friends Group who provides the funding for all of our educational programming like History for Lunch. So if y'all are interested in becoming a member or renewing your membership, there's applications available at the front desk. Also a reminder that the next History for Lunch is scheduled for actually next Wednesday, October the 1st at noon, featuring Dr. Kathleen Duvall, a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She will discuss how North Carolina's men and women responded to and contributed to the American Revolution, from the Edenton Tea Party to the Halifax Resolves to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. So we hope that you will join us for her presentation next week. And now today we welcome Courtney Doi. She is a member of the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. She will share the story of her grandmother, Judith Klein, who left Germany on the Kindertransport in December 1938, just after Kristallnacht. And she's going to be joining us today via Zoom. So please welcome our guest speaker.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Are we good?
Yes, we're good.
All right. Well, thank you all for having me here today. I hate that I can't see your faces, but I'm so excited to tell you the story of my grandmother. Before we get started, I love to just talk about my grandmother as a person. So this is a photo of her at her 90th birthday in 2015. So she lived till she was 91. She had a good long life. And I feel like a lot of times when we talk about the Holocaust and survivors, it's very black and white, and we're always thinking about them as victims. And I want you to know my grandmother is a person first. So she was a fiery woman. She loved to do the New York Times crossword and would boast to anyone that would listen that she could do it in pen 5 days a week. The weekends were harder to get it done in pen. She loved to knit and crochet. And you knew you were in trouble when she started speaking in another language. So she knew other languages and she would not say mean things to the kids in English, but she would definitely switch over to German or French and have a few choice words for us. So we knew when another language came out, we were in trouble and we needed to get in line. So the last thing I want you to know about my grandmother before we get started is that her favorite word was miracle. So it was a miracle if, the extended family could get together at Thanksgiving, but it was also a miracle, and it was a miracle in her words, if she was able to get the good parking space at the grocery store. So miracle was a word that I heard most of my life growing up. And so today I'm going to spend kind of our hour together talking to you about how it's a miracle that I'm here to tell this story. As we dive in, I also want to say that, I'm assuming that there's folks there of different ages and from different backgrounds. This is my grandmother's through my grandmother's eyes. So my grandmother was 13 when these events happened, and her perspective is different than her older siblings' perspectives. And so I think memory is an interesting thing. And so I tell the story as my grandmother told it to me. But, memory is interesting. So I think that it's really interesting to think about these are the tales that I was told from the lens of a 13-year-old's viewpoint, looking back at it. So. Okay, so despite my grandmother being my person, I spent every summer with her growing up. I did not know about her family history until I went to Berlin with her in 2001. So I knew that she was a German Jew. I knew that she got out of Germany. I knew that I loved her and didn't want to upset her and ask any questions. And my dad didn't like to talk about it. So I really had no details growing up. When I graduated from college, she wanted to send me to Israel to learn about my Jewish heritage because I was not raised Jewish. And I said, I don't want to go to Israel. I want to go to Germany. I want you to tell me about your history. And she said, I'll think about it. So a year after I graduated college, I found myself in Berlin. with my grandmother. I did not know the names of all of her siblings. I really didn't know her story until this trip. And we got off the plane. The first thing we did was go to the Jewish cemetery on Schönhauser Allee in Berlin to see her family plot. This is a photo from that first day. And then the rest of the time and for the rest of her life, she spent kind of the next 15 years just telling me every story and saying, "You're the historian. I want you to remember this." And so I feel very lucky to have had these experiences. So we're going to start back at the beginning. I got muted. Is everyone can hear me again?
Yep,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, it randomly muted me. Okay. So my grandmother was born to Irmgard and Heinrich in Berlin in 1925. They have an interesting love story as well. So, just like I was part of a mixed marriage of two different religions, so was my grandmother's parents. So, her father was a prominent Jewish lawyer. He met Irmgard through their parents, who were best friends in law school as well. And the families grew up together despite kind of having different backgrounds. And these two fell in love, and their parents said, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to get married." And they said they didn't care. And so when she came of age, they eloped and went on to have six children. So my grandmother is the youngest, but there was Haro, Ruth, Ola, Rolf, Etta, and my grandmother, Judith. And so you'll notice that my grandmother is by far the youngest, and her siblings did not let her forget about that. So, my grandmother, unlike many of her siblings, had a really happy childhood in Berlin. It is one of the places where she has her best memories. Her siblings that did survive, they didn't like to go back to Germany, but my grandmother really did. So, it's a picture of her and her mom. It's the one place that she remembered her whole family together. And I think because she was able to get out on the Kindertransport, she really does think of Germany and did think of Germany as this place where her family was all together. And it held a lot of happy memories. And I went with her, my cousins went with her. She went multiple times in the last years of her life to kind of relive and see these places. And it brought her joy instead of sadness, which I think is unique for a lot of Holocaust survivors. Her family was really active. They were wealthy. Her mother was the daughter of an ambassador, and her father was a Jewish lawyer and came from a family of lawyers. And so they traveled a lot. They like to go rock climbing, go adventuring, be outside at all times. And she had a really charmed life for the first like 10 years of her life, 8 to 10 years, she really did live a charmed life. Things started to take a turn for the worst in 1933. So, part of why I tell this story is my grandmother left me all of her journals. So, I'm going to read to you some of her words as we go through this. This is a picture of her siblings and her mom and a nanny at the beach. And so, she wrote about the last time that she went to the beach with her family. So, I'm going to read you that now. Father had put down his book and was talking to Mother. He thought this would probably be the last summer they could come here. The signs would go up soon, and even though the owner of the pension had told them they could come whenever they wanted to, he was not sure whether they could get a tourist card next year. And without that, one could not rent a Strandkorb, which are these huts. I thought it was strange that we would now abandon the beach where we had come ever since I could remember. Mother always told everyone how healthy the salt air was and advised everyone to take a deep breath before we got in the car to drive home. And now they were talking about not coming back here again. I put my head down on the rug. If we were not coming back again, I would have to remember the school holidays of 1933 as the last time we went to the beach. So in 1933, that is when Hitler came to power. And one of the first things that he did is start putting in laws at every level that restricted the rights of Jews. And so one of the first things is Holidays are not for Jewish people. You can't get a tourist card. You can't stay in a hotel. You can't rent a Strand Corp. And so, as these laws went into place, my grandmother's siblings started to leave, her older siblings. And so the first one to leave was Ulla. She went to England with her husband and her young children, and she'll come back to our story. The next one to leave was Haro. He went to Chile to work for a shipping company. And then eventually Rolf left and went to the Netherlands to go work to get out of Germany. And so her father was very adamant that this would blow over, that we were Germans first, not in that they'd weathered the First World War, they would weather the Second World War as well, and felt really kind of clung to home. And so thought that it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But my grandmother watched her older siblings say, "Hey, I think there's something different this time," and watched them leave. So things really begin to shift in the next 5 years. So 1933, Hitler came to power. All of these laws slowly came into being. And they went from being able to live at this country house right outside of Berlin. They had a tennis court and goats. They had just kind of this lovely existence. And then suddenly, her father was no longer allowed to practice law. They were no longer allowed to own property. And so by 1938, my grandparents moved from this larger house into an apartment in this building. So they were lucky because my grandmother's mom, Irmgard, was not Jewish. She was allowed to own property, and her parents had passed away and left this apartment building to her and her siblings. And so they went from living in this kind of large country estate to squeezing everyone into an apartment on one floor. That also meant that her dad's two sisters and his mom had to come live with them in the apartment as well because as Jews, they were no longer allowed to rent property. So by 1938, just before Kristallnacht, my grandmother, her two sisters, her two aunts, her grandma, and her parents were all on one floor of this building in an apartment and feeling lucky that they had somewhere to be. And then Kristallnacht happened. So Kristallnacht was December 8th and 9th, 1938, and it was the first kind of government-sponsored pogrom of the Jews in Germany. My grandmother was in Berlin. Uh, the German government said, "Hey, you can loot Jewish shops, you can burn synagogues. We're not going to do anything about it." They rounded up Jewish men and took them to work camps that would then become concentration camps for the first time. So her father was taken to Sachsenhausen, just outside of the city, where he was there for 2 weeks and had to do hard manual labor. And they tried to scare folks into then going back and telling their communities, "Hey, you need to listen and do anything that they say." And my grandmother was lucky and was part of kind of a miracle in this moment as well. So my grandmother was in the safest place that she could be on Kristallnacht. She was in the hospital recovering from appendicitis. And so she missed out on all of this. She had been in the hospital, and her older sister, Ruth, had been taking care of her. So this is the closest picture I have to her at 13. And this is her older sister, Ruth. And so Ruth left the hospital. My grandmother writes about this in her journal of leaving the hospital and went to go see what had happened, found out about her father, saw what was happening around town, came back, reported to my grandmother, and then made the decision that my grandmother was not going to stay. And so, against her father's wishes, while he was gone in Sachsenhausen, she got my grandmother on one of the first Kindertransports out of Germany. So she forged her parents' signatures and arranged everything. And so my youngest is Amelia Ruth, who was named after Ruth, who saved my grandmother's life. So the Kristallnacht was the beginning of November. And by December 28th, my grandmother was on her way out of Germany. And so my grandmother's story is unique in the fact that she wasn't happy about going, but she was okay to go. A lot of times when you learn about the Kindertransport where um, they got kids out of Germany, the kids didn't want to go. Their parents put them on a train and they were scared. They didn't know what was going on. This was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. For my grandmother, she was going to go be with her sister, and her older sister, who she looked up to more than anything, had said, "Hey, this is a good idea." She had seen her other siblings leave. And so I think she had a different perspective than most kids did in this situation. I know when I need to get my 13-year-old, who my grandmother was 13, I have a 13-year-old now, to do something, I call my 18-year-old daughter and say, "Hey, can you hint to Amelia that this is a good idea?" And so I feel like it was a little bit of a different scenario for my grandmother. So she wrote about her exodus from Germany to England in her synagogue newsletter in the 1970s. So I'm going to read you her story in her words right now. December 28th was a cold and drizzly day. The week before, there had been some last minute shopping, a new navy winter coat and warm underwear to last for 20 years, some jersey knit dresses, and a stout pair of shoes. Everything was packed into one small trunk. Books were left on the bookshelf, and the last doll had been given to the girls upstairs. A few photos of the family in an envelope had been put at the bottom of the trunk, and there was a purse with a wallet containing a birth certificate and vaccination form. And this is the actual birth certificate that came with her. Mother and father took me to the station in Berlin to meet with 47 other children. A 6-year-old stood in the cold at 8 a.m. holding on to his mother. She looked at me and asked if I had ever done any babysitting. Being the proud aunt of 2 nieces and a nephew at the age of 13 and a half, I assured her that I knew all about taking care of small children. She asked me to look after her small boy. The train left for Hamburg just after 8, and we got there about 10:30. A bus took us to the Jewish Community Center, where we had some hot chocolate and large chunks of fresh bread and jams. Then we got back on the bus and were driven to the USS Lyons docks in the harbor, where a truck had taken our luggage. It was about noon, and the SS Manhattan was supposed to leave on the tide at 2 p.m. The ship had just arrived, and there we stood, 48 children and 2 adults with our luggage, and the Gestapo refused to let us on board. We were the second group of what was to be over 14,000 Jewish children under 17 who left Germany and Austria to go to England before the outbreak of war. We had no passports, no exit visas, no money, but we were supposed to have a relative in England who would be responsible for us when we arrived. The small boy with me was to go to his aunt. My sister and her family were already in London. After the Kristallnacht, this was the only way out for many, but we did not know this at the time. We stood in the cold in the last week in December on an open wharf in Hamburg with the Gestapo standing beside the gangplank, and there was no way we could get aboard the ship. It was cold, we had said goodbye to our families, and we didn't know what was going to happen. So we stood there. The ship did not sail at 2 p.m. One gangplank was still down, and the lights on board were bright. It became dark. At 6 p.m., the captain came down the gangplank, and after a brief discussion with the Gestapo, we were allowed to take our suitcases in small trunks, and we walked up the gangplank one by one. The ship was unbelievably warm. There were stewards and nurses to help us as soon as we got on board, to take us to our cabins, to give us hot drinks, to take us to the dining room for the most fabulous dinner we had ever seen. Most of us could not eat. We were still too cold and too shaken. We soon found out what had happened. The Gestapo said that the 2 adults who had proper papers could go on board, but the children would have to stay behind. One of our companions had gone on board knowing that she could not get back and told the captain what had happened. And apparently he decided that since the USS Lyons had a 99-year lease on the dock, it was private property, and he therefore had told the Gestapo to remove themselves. The ship left just after midnight. We stopped briefly at Le Havre the next afternoon and docked in Southampton on December 30th, 1938, where the Jewish Refugee Committee met us with lists of where everyone was to go. I handed over my small friend to an elderly lady who was to take him to his aunt in the country. We had shared a cabin for 2 nights, and I had read him stories. He seemed to have held my hand for almost 2 days. I have never seen him since, and I have forgotten his name and the names of the other 46 children who stood with me on the docks in Hamburg. The train took us to London, where my brother-in-law met me at Victoria Station and took me to my sister's house in Maida Vale. The next day, we went to see Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, my New Year's treat. A few weeks later, an English girls' school adopted me. I put on a school uniform, went to live with an English family, learned English, and celebrated Passover in 1939 by reading the Haggadah in Hebrew and English. So my grandmother gets out right before the war in 1938. A few things about that story that I love to point out before we move on. One, that captain is what we call an upstanders. You hear about bystanders and upstanders during kind of war times. And, he decided that it was worth getting those kids on board. If he hadn't, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. The other piece is I always thought it was strange that my grandmother wrote about this kind of dramatic story about leaving Germany, and she brought up Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And I was able to see Eva Cross, the Anne Frank's stepsister, speak at Duke a few years ago. And she talked about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs too. And so during that time, it was in the movies and it was one of the first big Disney movies. And so my grandmother in Germany had been adopted by a girls' school. She had been kicked out of her public school, so she was with folks that were not Jewish. They were talking about the movie nonstop, and she wasn't allowed to go because she was a Jew. And so when she got to London, that was the first thing she wanted to do. It made her feel free. That was one of the first things that they did. And she always loved Disney movies and would always want to watch them with my children and with me growing up because it reminded her of this kind of moment of freedom for her. On the screen now, I've got some postcards. So before the war broke out, she could still write back to her family. So she had a sense of what was happening in Germany. And you'll notice this first one from January 1938, it's all in German. She did not know much English when she arrived in London. And by June, she was writing in English to her mom, who was fluent in English as well. Uh, I love how she kind of just dove in and learned the language. She wrote about it in her journal. She said, "There are times I have a serious problem with the English language. Perhaps it reflects the fact that at age 13 and a half, I only knew two English nursery rhymes. My real immersion came when I entered a girls' school in London and no one spoke German to me. There had been the occasion when I clutched the price of bread and walked 3 blocks to the grocery store reciting two large brown loaves over and over again. It didn't help to be told the store was sold out, particularly since the girl behind the counter spoke a strong version of Cockney, entirely unknown to me at the time. Finally, she took me by the hand and showed me the empty bread baskets. That sunk in, and I'd even added please to my recital." So she really did have to kind of be immersed and learn the language. I think kind of a sign of the times here is this is someone who came from a wealthy family. And this last postcard we have from June is a week before her 14th birthday. And she's been asked what she wants for her birthday. And the only thing that she wants is her mom to call her and gives her a time and a place that they would be. Because at that point, phone calls are expensive, it's hard to do. And so that was the only thing that she wanted us to hear, her mom's voice. And so I think that that just really tells you about the time. So once the war did break out, she could no longer communicate with her family that was left behind in Germany. And she also was no longer with her sister in London. So as right before the war broke out, the English government had Operation Pied Piper. And so what they did is they sent all the kids in London, because London was going to be a place that would be bombed a lot, out to foster families in the countryside. And families really didn't have a choice as to whether they were going to take children. My grandmother got really lucky. She was sent to Ely. And she was placed with the Dean family, who our family is still in contact with. My grandmother's husband is actually meeting next week with a little brother that was there, that, was her little foster brother. So she was lucky in that she got into a good place, but this was still a really hard time. So what you have to imagine is, yes, she's lucky she got out, but she's a German. She has a German accent. So people are making fun of her. She's seen as the enemy. She said she loved Latin and math classes because that's when language did not matter. And she's in this little town that's known for its cathedral, with a foster family going to a school. And so, one of my favorite stories from this time period is she talked about the first time that there was one other Jewish refugee girl in her, and they were let out of school for Yom Kippur because it's a high holiday in the Jewish religion. But they were like, there's no synagogue, there's no rabbi. What are we supposed to do? And so the two of them went and sat in the back pew of the Ely Cathedral for the entire day and tried to remember the service by heart, any little pieces they could remember. And they just decided that they were going to stay there and that God wouldn't care where they were as long as they were giving it their best go. And so that was one of my favorite memories that she told me about trying to hold on to that past life that she had and how different her life suddenly was um, at age 14. So she was in Ely for all 4 years of high school with a foster family. So she only had about 6 months in London with her sister before she was sent out here. She was able to work her way to the top of her class and was fluent in English. She always loved to listen to the radio and loved the BBC, and that's where she would repeat what they said so that no one would know that she was a German refugee. And so she had a British accent even to the day that she died, even after being in the United States for 50 years. She still had that perfect BBC accent in her English. So when she was here, she gets to the top of her class, and in order to go on to college at in England, you have to sit for your exams and you have to have a letter from your headmistress or headmaster. And her headmistress here said, "You German refugees have already gotten too much." I refused to write her a letter. So she was unable to go to college because she didn't have that letter of recommendation. And so she moved back to London. Um, at 18, got a job as a secretary, lived in an apartment with a bunch of other refugees, and quickly met my grandfather and had my dad in February 1945 in London. And this is the next miracle in the story. So, my grandmother lived near Paddington Station. So, if you know about Paddington Bear, you've seen the movies or heard the story. It's a major train station, and my father was born in Paddington Hospital. And so Paddington Station was a target for bombing. And this story is the craziest. My dad swears by it. My grandmother told it to me. But the night that my dad was born, my grandmother was in the maternity ward, and the hospital got hit by a bomb. They were trying to hit Paddington Station, but instead they hit the hospital and half of the maternity ward was blown off. She said she was holding my dad and could see the sky, and she just happened to be at the right place in the right time. Despite having gotten out of Germany, despite all of these other things, she was still kind of just barely getting by and having these close calls. And so my dad says that, yeah, he remembers growing up in London, playing in bombed out buildings, playing. That's what he did. And so it was part of his life from day one. So at this point, the war ends in 1945, and my grandmother hasn't heard anything from the people that were left behind on the continent because there's no way to write during wartime. And so, she had my dad, she got married, she got through school, and had no contact with her mother and father. And it wasn't until after the war that she was able to find out what had happened to her family. So I'm going to kind of recap what had happened while she was growing up in London. So the first person that passed away in Germany was her father in 1942. So about 3 years after she got out, he realized that he needed to try to get his other two daughters out. And he arranged for them to escape to the Netherlands to go be near Rolf with a train full of Dutch workers. So he got fake paperwork and he got money, and they were supposed to sneak onto this train and go. And they got caught at the train station. All the paperwork led back to him. And so he was arrested and taken to Gestapo headquarters where he was beaten to death. Um, so he was the first one who passed away. At that point, Etta and Ruth were arrested. They were in Berlin in a jail for a while, and then they were eventually um, deported to Tiersen or Tierstadt. And so this is a really interesting place. I went there with my grandmother in the sense that it is gorgeous. It is a walled city that was built by an emperor for his wife. You look at it and everything looks lovely and nice. It was where the Red Cross visited, and it was seen to be a retirement town for the Jews, but it really was anything but. And so they were sent there along with their grandmother and their two aunts. Eventually, were in Tiersen as well. And one of the things that I think is just crazy, if you look at the map, is this is a very small town. And at one point, there were 85,000 Jews living in there. So when you think about a concentration camp and you look at those few blocks, 85,000 people. So you can understand kind of why the living conditions were so bad. So at Tiersen, Ruth was the first to pass away in 1943. She had a history of health issues, and so she just could not handle life in the camp. The picture on the right is a picture of a Stolperstein, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's a stumbling block. It's a memorial. And this is outside of her art school. It was inside because they were doing construction, but shows that she was deported to Tiersen in 1943 and died there in 1943. Her sister Etta was able to survive the war in Tiersen. We have her ID card on the back in the middle of that. It shows where she would go out. They would log her in and out if she was going to work outside of the walls. Um, Germans kept really good records, and because her mother was a Mischling, or she was Mischling, and her mother was not Jewish, she was able to write to her mother. So there's a stack of cards that her mother kept and that was in my grandmother's things. They look like these. They're postcards. You can see that um, it's written to from Tierenstadt from Etta Veit Simon. And then on the other side, it goes to Irmgard Simon at the apartment building that I showed you. And every single one of them says, Bin gesund Mutter, which is I'm good mother, because you couldn't really say anything else if you wanted them to send it. And so she would just write that over and over again to let her mom know that she was still alive. Rolf was one of the siblings that was able to leave Germany, but Hitler invaded the Netherlands, and so he also was unable to survive. And so when he was in the Netherlands, he met Sabine and had a love affair, wrote letters back. We've got letters from him to his mom, um, talking about their love story, but also talking about how things were getting worse and worse. And this is a picture of them on their wedding day. You can see the yellow star on his suit. The two of them were eventually sent to Westerbork, which is a work camp in the Netherlands, and then they both died in Auschwitz. Sabine went straight to the gas chambers, and Rolf was able to live for a few months working before he died there, just before the war ended. In London, um, my grandmother had three kids really quickly, and just was trying to get news during all of this time. My dad was about 2 years old when Etta and Irmgard, who both had survived, were able to get out of Europe and make it to uh, England to reunite with her. My dad says that it's the one thing he will talk about is he remembers being scrubbed from head to toe in order to go meet his grandmother and his aunt for the first time. Because Irmgard was there and because she was starting to get reparations from the German government, my grandmother was able to leave a not so great marriage, which was kind of unheard of in the 1950s, and move in with her mom and eventually go back to school because she always wanted to go to college. And so she ended up studying at the London School of Economics. and getting a degree. And while she was there, she met the man who I've always known as my grandfather and who got our family over to the United States. This is a picture of them on their wedding day. My dad is on the right. He was 13 at the time, and then that's his sister and brother. And Irmgard's in the center with the black hat. She was able to be there for her daughter's wedding day. And so they got married and she came to the United States and she was able to continue her education. She got a master's in economics, and was a published author and for economic research and taught at the University of Maryland. So she was able to live kind of this great life. Uh, and then, she raised her children. She raised children with Tom. She had two more kids once she came to the United States. And we grew up not really talking about this history at all. And then, like I said, in 2001, I asked her to take me to Germany and the floodgates opened. Suddenly she was ready to talk and to tell these stories again. And so these are some pictures from that first trip of the Jewish cemetery in Berlin. On the left is our family plot because there were people left behind that could fix it up and take care of it. And on the right is what the rest of the cemetery looked like. Broken stones, overgrown trees. Um, it was very kind of jarring to see the difference. Every year I've gone back, they've slowly repaired and cleaned it up. And so it's really amazing to see the changes that have happened in the cemetery over the years. But on the gate going in there, it says, "In here, keep the silence, and out there, break it." And that's just what my grandmother did, and what I hope to do by telling her story, and keeping her and her family's memory alive. She went on to take each of my cousins over to Germany to learn the family history after our trip. And I was able to take my daughter just after her death when she was 10 to go see. This is something that I think Germany does a good job of. Some people would argue maybe too good of a job of. There is monuments everywhere to this part of the history. So, for example, this is a glass wall in Rathaus Stieglitz, which is a neighborhood. It's got a market. You can see in the back in the reflections. There's stands. It's in the middle of everything. There's no way to avoid it. And these are deportation lists. And so it just happened that on those deportation lists are she's pointing to, and my daughter is looking at Hedwig, Eva, and Katerina Simon. So that was her grandmother and her two aunts just happened to be on the list that they decided to put on the memorial. One of the other things that Germany does to kind of keep this history alive is they have what they call Stoppelsteins. So they started putting these in the ground, an artist, in 1996, and you'll find them all over Germany, Czech Republic. My daughter found some in Italy when she was traveling. And what they do is they are put outside of a place where people lived, so where Jews lived. This is outside of a house where my grandmother's aunts lived, and this is their Stoppelsteins. I went to represent my grandmother just after her death at this ceremony where they put the stones in. But you can really see what these look like here because they're brand new. So she was unwillingly moved to Berlin in 1938. She was deported in 1942. She went from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz in 1944, where she died. And so you'll find these where it tells the story of individuals throughout Germany in front of where they lived. And so I think that that makes a big difference. When we were there for this ceremony back in 2017, one of the things that really struck me is talking to the government officials. They said that the first Jewish family had just moved back into this town. So the war ended in 1945. The first Jewish family had just moved back into this town. And they were hoping that by doing this, it would make others feel more welcome by kind of recognizing this past, which completely blew my mind. So I like to end here. This is a picture of my grandmother dancing at my wedding. She was someone who, she's a cynical optimist, is what my uncle likes to call her. She saw the worst that the world could give you, and she chose to see the best in everything. Everything was a miracle. And despite everything that she went through, she was able to kind of see the bright side in life and to be appreciative of everything that she got to experience that her siblings did not. I like to end with a quote from an author uh, who wrote a book. Who's from North Carolina. Her grandmother was also a Holocaust survivor. And this passage just really speaks to me. And so, like, I always like to end my speeches here. A miracle. How many times had I heard Grandma use that word? That you even exist is a miracle. A miracle that you're here, a miracle we're alive, a miracle that we survived. As a child, I thought miracles were good, but Jewish tradition teaches that miracles are ambiguous. After all, if the universe really was created in the image of the divine spirit, there should be no need for miracles. A miracle happens when we humans rip holes in the universe's perfection, and the divine spirit bleeds through the holes. Thus, a miracle cannot prevent or undo the damage humans inflict. It can only alleviate some of the suffering caused by the damage. The question that follows a miracle is the same as the question provoked by tragedy. Why me? And in those days, the only answer I could summon was to remember. So thank you for letting me remember my grandmother today. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have about her family or this history.
Yes. Courtney, thank you so much for sharing your grandmother's story. Does anybody have any questions for her today? No? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so one of the brothers went to the Netherlands, they got invaded. One of the sisters went to England, met up with your grandmother. Did you say what happened to the brother that went to Chile?
I did not. So yeah, he went to Chile. He ended up kind of hiding his Jewish past and his Jewish history. Had a family, was Catholic, and was found and was found by his sisters in the 1970s and had to kind of come clean about it. But kept in touch. I've got my grandmother's journals. There's tons of letters between her and Haro talking. But he lived till he was 99. Um, we were gonna all go down for his 100th birthday, and he died a few weeks beforehand. So I never got to meet him, but I did get to meet his sons and his grandsons. So it's been really great to get to know more about his family and their perspective because it wasn't something that they knew about growing up.
Any other questions? Well, Courtney, thank you again so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time to share your grandmother's story. And we appreciate all of y'all coming out to the museum today, and we hope to see y'all next week. Thank you for coming.
All right, thank you.